Thank you very much. Thank you very much for showing up again. That's really good to see everybody here. So, one of the things that I've been realizing as a consequence of going through these stories is that the degree to which they're about individuals is quite remarkable. And I think that's really telling. You know, one of the reasons I prefer Dostoevsky to Tolstoy is because Tolstoy is more of a sociologist. He's more interested in the relationship between groups of people. This is an oversimplification because obviously Tolstoy is a great author, but I like Dostoevsky better because he really delves into the souls of individuals, and I think it's remarkable the degree to which all of the stories that we've covered so far in Genesis are about individuals, and they're quite realistic, which is quite remarkable too. They're not really romanticized to any great degree because all of the people that are regarded, let's say, as patriarchal or matriarchal figures in Genesis have no shortage of ethical flaws and also no shortage of difficulties in their life. And the difficulties are realistic. They're major league problems, you know, like familial catastrophes and famine and war and revenge and hatred and all those things. It's not a pretty book, and that's one of the things that makes it great. I mean, that's one of the things that characterizes great literature, right? Is that it doesn't present you with a whitewashed view of humanity or of existence, and that's really a relief, I think, because as you all know, because you're alive, there's no such thing as a whitewashed existence. Like to be alive is to be in trouble. Ethically and existentially. I've been reading this book recently. I'll talk about it a little bit later. It's called Better Never to Have Been. And it was written by a philosopher in South Africa, in Cape Town, named Benatar. That's his last name. And he basically argues, I think it's a specious argument, and I think it's artificially constructed. But he basically argues that because life is so full of suffering, even good lives are very much full of suffering, that it's wrong to bring children into the world because the suffering outweighs the good, even in good lives. And it's actually wrong, it would also be better not to exist for exactly the same reason. And my sense in reading the book is that he came to that conclusion and then wrote the book to justify it, which is actually the reverse of the way that you should write a book. What you should do when you're writing a book is you should have a question, and it should be a real question, right? It should be one you don't know the answer to. And then you should be studying and writing like mad and reading everything you can get your hands on to see if you can actually grapple with the problem and come to some solution. And you should walk the reader as well through your process of thinking so that they can come to not necessarily to the same conclusion, but at least track what you're doing. And I don't think that's what he did. I think he wrote it backwards. But then, and so I was thinking about it a lot because that's actually a question that I've contended with in my writing. There are Mephistophelian or satanic figures, for example, in Goethe's Faust, and also Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov, who basically make the same case, you know, that existence is so rife with trouble and suffering that it would be better if it didn't exist at all. And the problem I've had with that, there's a variety of them, but one of the problems I've had with that is what happens if you start to think that way, because what I've observed is that people who begin to think that way, that isn't where they stop. Like, they get angry at existence, which is what happened to Cain, as we saw in the Cain and Abel story, and then the next step is to start taking revenge against existence, and that cascades until it's revenge against, well, I think the best way of thinking about it is revenge against God for the crime of being, which is, I think, the deepest sort of hatred that you can entertain. And when you're in the grip of a really deep emotion, like a really profound emotion, right at the bottom of emotions, you're in something that's like a quasi-religious state, and that's more or less independent of your belief, say, in a transcendent deity. I mean, you can be in a profoundly emotional state that's as deep as it can be, and it can have religious significance without that necessarily signifying anything about a transcendent being, you know. But then I was thinking, see, the problem with that argument is you can gerrymander it endlessly, you know, because first of all, how do you measure suffering and how do you measure happiness? It's like, how do you assign weights to them? And God, there's just no way of doing that. You have to do it arbitrarily. And so you can make an argument that the suffering outweighs the happiness. You just weight the suffering more heavily than you weight the happiness, and that's the end of that, you know. And so that's a problem. But I think there's a deeper problem. And I was reading this other book a while back as well, which was written by the guy who ran the Human Genome Project. And I don't remember exactly what it was called, but it was something like A Scientist's Case for God, or something like that. And one of the things he referred to, which didn't strike me as hard as it should have to begin with, was he thought that one of the phenomena, say, that justified a belief in a transcendent being was something like the moral intuition of human beings, that, you know, we have a sense of right and wrong. And, you know, it's certainly what happens in Genesis in the story of Adam and Eve is that story announces the coming of the sense of right and wrong, right? The knowledge of good and evil. And it isn't something we ascribe to animals. It's something that's unique to human beings. Animals can be predators and, you know, and they can be gentle and you can have a relationship with them, but you never think of an evil cat or, you know, or an evil wolf, even though they're, you know, they're predatory. But human beings, we have this capacity to judge between good and evil, right and wrong. And it's really an integral part of our being. And I think you can make an evolutionary case for that, a biological case for that, as you can make a biological case for most of what is relevant about human beings, because we're biological creatures. But we don't really understand the significance of that. Like, what happens in the story of Adam and Eve is that realization, that coming to the knowledge of good and evil, is actually represented as a shift of cosmic significance, right? It puts a permanent fracture in the structure of being. And, you know, if you think of human beings as insignificant ants on a tiny dust mote in the middle of an infinite cosmos, a cosmos that cares less for us, then who cares fundamentally if human beings have the knowledge to distinguish between good and evil? But if you give consciousness a central role in being, and you can make a perfectly reasonable case for that, because without consciousness there's no being, as far as anyone can determine, so it may be much more central than we think. And I really don't think there's a counter-argument to that. Like, not a solid one. You can state that consciousness is epiphenomenal and that the world is fundamentally materialistic and it doesn't matter that there's consciousness. You can state that, but you can make an equally credible case the other way. And certainly our lived experience is that consciousness is crucial, obviously, and we treat each other as if most of the time we're valuable conscious beings, and we wouldn't give up our consciousness, even though it's often consciousness of suffering. And so then I think another problem with the book is that it's sort of predicated on the idea that life is for happiness. And I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's how people experience life, and I might be wrong, but it seems to me that people experience life as something like a series of crucial ethical decisions. It's something like that. I mean, I just can't imagine, and maybe I'm being naive about this, but I can't imagine another being that's like me in most senses, that isn't constantly wrestling in some sense with what the next proper thing to do is. It's not like it's obvious. It's not bloody obvious. And it doesn't mean you'll do the right thing, because you don't lots of times. And you know that by your own judgment, right? Because you're making mistakes all the time. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing, and maybe it's a mistake, and maybe it isn't. And who's to say? But that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you know that what you're doing is wrong, and you go ahead and do it anyways. People do that all the time. And that's also extremely peculiar. You bloody well think that if you knew it was wrong, and you told yourself that it was wrong, that would be sufficient, so that you just wouldn't do it. But that isn't what you're like at all, you know. And you can tell yourself something is wrong 50 times, and you'll do it the 51st time, and then you'll feel, you know, like you deserve to feel, probably. But it doesn't stop you. And so then I think the other problem with the viewpoint, the idea that the suffering of life eradicates its utility, is that it's predicated on the idea that happiness, or lack of suffering even, is the right criteria by which to judge life. And I don't think that's how we actually experience life. I think what we do instead is put ourselves through a series of excruciating moral choices. You know, and one of the things that's really significant about the biblical stories, and I think about the entire implicit philosophy, you know, that's embedded in the stories, is that that's how life is presented in the stories, is all of these individuals. First, they're individuals, they're not groups. And second, they're agonizing over their moral choices all the time. And they have a relationship with God, but it's not a directive relationship exactly. Even the people to whom God speaks directly, which I suspect is not something you'd exactly want to have happen, they're still, even the fact that they have a direct relationship with God doesn't stop them from being tormented continually by their moral choices. And so the world is presented as a moral landscape, not as a place that justifies itself by happiness. It's presented as a moral landscape, and people are presented as creatures who traverse through the moral landscape, making ethical decisions that determine the course of the world. And that seems to me to be right. And that's not the same as happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's a whole different category of being. And, you know, and then I've thought that through a lot, and I think, well, we do make choices, and what we do is contend with the future, you know. And the future seems to appear to us as a realm of possibility. That's a more accurate way of thinking about it than that the future presents itself to us as a realm of determined things. It presents itself as a realm of possibility, and there's good choices in that realm, and there's poor choices or even evil choices in that realm. And we're negotiating continually, deciding which of those choices we're going to bring into being. That seems to me to be phenomenologically indisputable, and we certainly treat each other as if that's what we're doing, because we hold each other responsible for our actions, you know, with some exceptions, and that we're deciding each moment whether to make things better or worse. And that seems to me to be correct. And I think that that's what these stories illustrate. They don't say that directly, you know, although I think it gets more and more explicit as the narrative unfolds. And then part of the realism of the stories is that the people that are being presented are by no means good. I mean, maybe with the exception of Noah. Noah seemed to be a pretty good guy. He did get drunk and, you know, and end up naked, exposed to his sons and so forth. But I mean, he isn't talked about a lot as a character. It's a pretty compressed story. But Abraham had plenty of problems, not least of which was his inability to leave home, and then, you know, his lying about his wife, and there's all sorts of mistakes. And then Jacob, who we're going to talk about tonight, is an even more morally ambivalent character. He's, especially at the beginning of the story, he isn't the sort of person that you would pick out, especially if you were a hack writer. You wouldn't pick him out as the hero of the story. He does a lot of things that are really pretty reprehensible. And it takes him an awful long time to learn better. And yet he's the person who's put forward as the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's from this flawed person that the people whose story you might say is at the fundamental, constitutes the fundamental underpinning of our culture. It's from this deeply flawed individual that group emerges. And so you might think of that as a relief too, because, you know, you're no knight in shining armor, you know, with a pure moral past. I mean, people make mistakes of catastrophic proportions non-stop, you know. And that also means that these stories put forward something approximating hope, because in their realism, in their moral realism, they present heroes, I suppose, the heroes of renown, right? The patriarchs of old, let's say, who are realistic people, who have fits of anger and rage, and who are murderous at times, and who are deeply embroiled with family dispute, and who have adulterous affairs, and like they do all the terrible things that people do. And the weird thing is that God is still with them. And it isn't obvious what that means, or even if it means anything, but it's not disputable as far as I can tell that we're conscious, and that consciousness is a transcendent phenomena which we do not understand, and that the landscape that we traverse through is moral. Like every story you ever watch, anything that grips your imagination on the screen or in the theater, or like any story that grabs you, is a story of moral striving. It's just not interesting otherwise, right? The person has to be confronted with complex moral choices, and then you see the outcome. And the good guy does it right, and the bad guy does it badly, and things don't go so well for the bad guy generally. And if it's a bit more sophisticated, the good and the bad are in the same individual, and that's a more compelling story. But so we could say, well, we could make the assumption that it might be worthwhile thinking of the world as it has been thought of classically, as a theater upon which the forces of good and evil continually strive for dominance. And for the life of me, especially after I started reading deeply into 20th century history and all the terrible things that happened in the 20th century, and all the terrible, unbelievably incomprehensible things that people did to one another, I just couldn't see seeing things any other way as realistic. Because I don't think that you can immerse yourself in 20th century history without coming to the conclusion that evil is a reality. And if it's a reality, it depends on what you mean by reality, but it's a fundamental enough reality for me. And if it's a reality, then I don't see how you can escape from the conclusion that the cosmos, as we experience it at least, is a place of moral striving. And well, that's one of the things that's really illustrated in the story of Jacob, and I found that quite striking. So the last lecture, I ended with the Abrahamic stories, with the death of Sarah, and that was Abraham's wife. And so we're going to continue from there. Remember, Abraham had a son, Isaac, and he was asked by God to sacrifice his son, which we talked about in some depth. And I was attempting to make the case that, the idea of sacrifice was one of humankind's great discoveries, because it meant the discovery of the future, essentially, but it also meant the discovery that the future was something that you could make a bargain with, and that you could give up something now, something impulsive, some pleasure, even a deep pleasure in the moment, and you could strive, and hypothetically you could make a covenant, a bargain with the future, and if your sacrifices were acceptable, and that seemed to mean ethically acceptable, you had to sacrifice the right thing, that vastly increased the probability that not only you would be successful, let's say, but that your descendants would be too. And I don't think that that's an irrational proposition. I mean, you have to leaven it a bit with the realization that sometimes you get sliced off at the knees no matter what, right? Because life has an arbitrary element, and that can't be tossed out. But building in the arbitrary element, we'll say, you still want to think, well, what's your best bet given a certain amount of randomness? And it seems to me that conscious, self-aware sacrifice and proper ethical striving is your best bet. And, there's another idea that, well, I've always explained it. When I've explained it to people, I've always used the movie Pinocchio as an example, that when Geppetto is trying to make his puppet into a self-aware and autonomous moral agent, which is what he wants above all else, he aims at the highest good that he can conceive, which is the star that he prays to, essentially, and hopes for the transformation. And there's also something in that that's unutterably profound, and maybe that is somewhat independent of the idea that you have to believe in God. I would also say that what it means to believe in God in the Old Testament is by no means clear. And that's something I also really want to talk about tonight. It's not obvious what it means. And, well, Geppetto, what he does at least is aim at the highest good of which he can conceive. And that's actually been a philosophical definition of God upon occasion, that God is the highest good of which you conceive. And, that's different than the idea of a transcendent being precisely, but it's in line with certain interesting psychoanalytic speculations. This is one of the things I really liked about Carl Jung. Jung was so radical a thinker, it's just beyond belief. Like, I've read a lot of critics of Jung, and I've always got a kick out of them, because the things they accuse Jung of are so trivial compared to the things that Jung actually did, that it's like accusing a murderer of jaywalking. Like, because Jung was unbelievably radical. Like, here's one of his ideas. He thought that it was necessary. He believed that psychotherapy could be replaced by a supreme moral effort. And so the moral effort would be something like aiming at the good and then trying to integrate yourself around that. And that the good at which you aimed would be something approximating what you would be like if you manifested your full potential. And that you'd have a glimmering of what that full potential was. So that would be the potential future you. And he thought of people as four-dimensional entities, essentially, that were stretched across time. And that you, as a totality across time, including your potential, manifested yourself also in the here and now. And that part of what your potential manifested itself was something like the voice of conscience or intuition. It's an amazing idea. It's an amazing idea, right? Because it's like what you could be in the future beckons to you in the present and helps you determine the difference between good and evil. It's a mind-boggling idea. And, I think that it's an idea you have to contend with. And then he went further than that, and this is also a remarkable idea. He was interested in the symbolic representation of Christ, and I mean psychologically speaking, and he thought of Christ as the representation of the ideal potential human. It's something like that. So it was a symbolic, at minimum, that's what Christ was, is a symbolic representation of the ideal potential of a human being. And so for Jung, there was no psychological difference between who you could be in the future, beckoning to you in the present, and orienting yourself in relationship to Christ. Psychologically, those were the same thing. And then, so that's a pretty mind-boggling idea. Like, seriously, that's a mind-boggling idea. Especially when you add the psychological idea that one of the things that characterizes your ideal future self is the ability to make sacrifices, right? And the deeper the sacrifice, the better. And then also to recover from the sacrifice, right? So that's the death and rebirth. So the part of you that's most essential to your full flowering as a being is your ability to let things go and then spring back from that. So to die in some sense and to be reborn in the service of a higher good. And then the next part of that is that the direction of the world depends on you doing that. So not only your own life, but your family's life. And because we're networked so intently together, the whole panoply of humankind and maybe the structure of the cosmos. And, you might think, well, no, but, it's not so simple. It's not so simple. First of all, one person can wreak an awful lot of havoc. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And as we get more technologically powerful, that becomes even more relevant and important and crucial. One of the things that Jung said was that we had to wake up because we are too technologically powerful to be as morally asleep as we are. And that seems to me just to be self-evident. That's, yeah, for sure, that's true. We're half asleep with nuclear bombs. It's not a good idea. It's seriously not a good idea. And so, and then you might ask yourself too, what is the ultimate potential of a fully developed human being? And, we certainly know that you have admiration for people who are more developed rather than less developed. That just happens automatic, or resentment, but that's okay, it's the same thing, it doesn't matter. But it's not like you can't identify them. You can identify them, and they're put forward to you in drama and fiction and all of that constantly. So that's another form of moral intuition. You can discern the wheat from the chaff, let's say. And so the other thing that I was thinking about that's worth consideration too is that, and maybe this is petty, but I don't think it is. Somebody asked me the other day if I believed in miracles, and I hate being asked questions like that, And it's also people ask me, do I believe in God? And I don't know what they mean when they say that, and so I don't know what to answer, because I don't think we're necessarily going to talk about the same thing. But in any case, I said yes. And I have a variety of reasons for that. But one of them is that, the consensus among physicists is that we can track the origin of the cosmos to something like 100 millionth of a second after the Big Bang. It's so close to the Big Bang that the difference is literally infinitesimal. But the consensus is that before that, whatever that is, the laws of physics themselves break down. Well, what do you call an event that exists outside the laws of physics? That, by definition, that's a miracle. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a transcendent deity that caused the event. That's a separate issue. But it does imply a barrier of some sort beyond which we can't go, where some other set of rules apply. And so I find that interesting as well. So, all right. So Sarah dies, and Abraham makes a bargain with the Hittites to purchase a burial place for her, and they offer it as a gift, and he insists upon paying for it. It's a little story that basically indicates two things: that Abraham was the kind of guy that you trust pretty much when you see him, and that even if something is offered to him as a gift, he's going to do everything to be reciprocal about it. And so it's not a massively important part of the story, but it's in keeping with the same narrative flow. And so Ephron, who's a Hittite, offers a burial place as a gift, and Abraham says, no, you have to let me pay for it. And Ephron says he will, and that works out very well. And so he has a good burial place for his wife. And then Abraham decides that Isaac needs a wife. And so he sends his eldest servant to Mesopotamia to find a wife for Isaac. And there's this strange ritual that's performed. So it says in the story that the servant places his hand under Abraham's thigh to swear, but that isn't really what it means. It means that he places his hand, I don't know exactly how to say this properly. Well, use your imagination. How about that? And the idea is that, as far as I can tell, that he's swearing on the future. He's swearing on future people. It's something like that. So that's sort of what testify means, right? Think about the root. Well, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. That is the derivation, right? It is the derivation. So anyways, this is a serious issue. And so that servant has to go and find Isaac a good wife, and he wants him to find Isaac a wife who is willing to accept the same fundamental belief system, which is something like the belief in a God that's a unity rather than a plurality. The other thing that Jung was very insistent upon was that there was a relationship between polytheism and psychological confusion, and monotheism and psychological unification. And I really like that idea too, that what you're trying to do, because you are a plurality, that's one of the things the psychoanalysts were really good at figuring out that the cognitive scientists haven't touched yet, as far as I can tell. They're way behind the psychoanalysts in that element of thinking, is that you are composed of sub-personalities, which all have their own desires and their own viewpoint, and their own thoughts, and their own perceptions, and they're in a war with each other constantly. Maybe even a Darwinian war. It's been portrayed that way by certain neuroscientists. And that one of the goals of life is to integrate all of that plurality into a hierarchical ethical structure that has some canonical ethic at the pinnacle, right? We've talked a little bit about that. And it's not obvious what should be at the pinnacle, but we can guess at it. It's that which we admire. That's one way of thinking about it. It's that describes fair play across a sequence of games. That's another good way of thinking about it. It's the heroic ideal. That's another way of thinking about it. But it's combined with generosity. Because the mythological hero, goes out into the unknown and slays the dragon and gets the gold. but then comes back to the community and distributes what's found. And so it's courage plus generosity. And so all of that interior struggling that you're doing is an attempt to bang yourself against the world with challenge constantly, to hit everything together like you're beating on a piece of iron to cure it, let's say, so that you're not an internal contradiction, you're not a massive competing God, something like that, because it's just too psychologically stressful and hard on everyone else and impossible for them to get along with you if you're one thing one moment and another thing another moment. And so anyways, Abraham insists that Isaac find a wife from among people who are likely to carry forward the monotheistic tradition. And I'm not sure that the monotheistic tradition is actually distinguishable from the individualistic tradition. I think they might be the same thing at different levels of analysis, So, because individual means undivided in some sense, right? To be an individual means to be one thing. And the other thing that mitigates against the idea of life as happiness is it isn't obvious to me that it's happiness that is what molds you and shapes you. It's something more like optimal challenge, voluntarily undertaken. It's something like that, right? And I think that's echoed in the idea that everyone has a moral obligation to raise their cross, something like that, to accept the fact of their mortality voluntarily. I believe that that's the case. And I do actually think that that's a prerequisite to proper psychological development, because if you're not willing to take your mortality on voluntarily, like if you're kicking and fighting about it constantly, and you have every reason to, don't get me wrong, then you can't act forthrightly in the world, right? You're going to be afraid, and when you're afraid, then you can't voluntarily take on a challenge, and then if you can't voluntarily take on a challenge, then you can't develop. And so, again, the life seems to be something like, if it's a proper life, is the voluntary taking on of great challenges. And maybe that's better than happiness. Like, it's certainly more noble, It's not a word we use very much anymore, the idea of nobility, because we're so obsessed with happiness. But I think happiness is like, if it comes along, man, great, wonderful. Don't take it lightly or for granted, because it's fleeting. But the idea that that's what you should be for, in some sense, just seems to me, if that's what life is for, then maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe that's correct, because that isn't what life is. But it isn't obvious to me that that's what life should be. If you really loved someone, like your son, let's say, would you say, well, I hope he has a happy life? Or would you say, I hope he accomplishes great things? It seems to me that that's better, the accomplishing of great things, and because that's admirable, It's like a happy person is a happy person, but a noble person is an admirable person, and that's better, man. And so maybe there are better things than happiness. And so you can't judge being on the basis of the ratio of suffering to pleasure, something like that. And I don't think we do that. I don't believe we do that. Comedians are happy, right? But everyone doesn't aspire to be a comedian. And you don't watch comedy all the time, even though you can laugh nonstop, more or less, if the comedian's funny. You want to get your teeth into something. It also seems to me that, and this is one of the reasons I liked existential philosophy, was that the existentialists believed, it's sort of an original sin idea. They believed that we came into the world with an ethical burden already laden upon us, something like that, and that we had a felt sense that it was necessary for us to justify our being. And that if we didn't do that, then we weren't authentic to ourselves, we weren't moving towards individuality, we weren't sustaining the community, we weren't living properly, and that idea was deeply embedded in people as part of their ordinary experience. And that also seems to me to be accurate. And I've dealt with lots of people, say in my clinical practice, and they don't really they will come and say, I wish I wasn't so unhappy. But they don't usually come and say, I wish I was happier. And those things aren't the same. And then when you talk to people who are having trouble, they want to straighten things out and figure out how to do them right. It's something like that. And that's their primary goal. And so anyways, Abraham sends his eldest servant off to the place that God has granted him to find a wife. And interestingly, the borders of the promised land are quite similar to the current borders of Israel. I mean, these are estimates, right, based on the biblical, and I mean, that's not a fluke, obviously, but it's interesting to see the concordance between these ancient stories and the present day world. So I thought that was very interesting, and it shows, once again, that the past, you think the past is the past, but it's not. It's still here. It's embedded in the present, Just like the future in some ways is folded up inside the present, waiting to unfold. The past is all folded up inside the present too. So anyways, the servant goes to the land that he's been charged to go to, and he's trying to figure out, how in the world am I going to find a good wife for Isaac? I mean, I don't know any of these people. And so he has this little dialogue that's presented in the form of a prayer, I suppose. And he thinks, well, I'm going to go to the place where where people get water and water the animals, and because that's a place where everyone gathers, so that's a good place to find someone. And it's not a place of fun and lightness and relaxation and impulsivity. It's a place of life-sustaining work. And he thinks something like, well, what would a decent girl do at a watering place? And he thought, well, maybe she would offer a stranger some water and also offer to water the camels, because that would be brave to approach the stranger, and then generous, and then indicative of the willingness to make an effort. And when you know that a camel, I think he took 10 camels. It was quite a few camels anyways, not just one. And that a camel can drink 20 gallons of water. And Rebecca, who was drawing water from the well, turns out to be Rebecca, was drawing water from the well, which was hard, right? Because water's heavy and you have to lift it up. And it's 10 camels, and so that's like 200 gallons of water. So, she has to put herself out a fair bit in order to make this stranger happy. And so that's what happens. And then the servant has brought along gifts and that sort of thing. And anyways, to make a long story short, Rebecca agrees to come back with the servant and marry Isaac. And so then she gets pregnant and she has twins. And this is an interesting thing. The twins fight inside her. She can tell that they're not getting along. And this is an echo, right? It's an echo of Cain and Abel. And there's a mythological motif that the Jungians have called the hostile brothers. And you see them all the time. Batman and the Joker are hostile brothers, and Thor and Loki are hostile brothers. And it's an unbelievably common motif. And, the ultimate hostile brothers are Christ and Satan. So that's the archetypal representation of the hostile brothers, right? The ultimate good and the ultimate evil. And so it's an echo of the Cain and Abel story, although it's a little more complex, I would say, from a literary point of view, because it isn't obvious which of these brothers is Cain and which of them is Abel. They have parts of both in each of them. So Esau, who turns out to be one of the brothers, and Jacob, who turns out to be the other, both have their admirable qualities and their faults. Anyways, Esau is born first, but Jacob has him by the heel. And so there was a fight within the womb to see who would emerge first. Now, that's relevant because the firstborn had a special status, has a special status in many communities, especially agricultural communities, and there's the reason these people were more herds people. But if you divide your property equally among all your children, then in like 3 generations, everybody has one goat and everybody starves to death. Or the same thing happens with land. So one of the ways that traditional communities solve that is they just give almost everything to the firstborn. And then everyone else knows, well, you go out and do whatever you can. And it's kind of arbitrary and unfair, but at least it's predictably arbitrary and unfair instead of doom over 4 generations, So it actually mattered to be the firstborn. And God generally favors the firstborn. And then you might think, well, what is it about being born first that's so relevant, apart from the cultural practice of a more generous inheritance. And I would say, well, the firstborn is something like the model for the leader of the family, right? Because the firstborn child should be, if there's a number of siblings, A should take care of the siblings, at least to some degree, but also should be a role model for them. So it's like a natural position of leadership. But there's a psychologization of the idea of the firstborn in these stories, because God often passes over the firstborn in favor of a later born child. He seems to do that on the basis of moral character, essentially. And so there's this idea that, well, there's a natural proclivity towards leadership that's just a biological fact that would be associated with being a firstborn, but there's an element of characterological development that transcends that, and so that it's more important to be spiritually a firstborn, let's say, than to be biologically a firstborn. And God recognizes that continually in these stories and inverts the natural order and favors a later born who's done more work with regards to characterological development. And that's also interesting too. You know, I've talked to lots of business people about leadership, and there's a literature on leadership, but it's not a good literature. It's pretty shallow. Partly because it's not that easy to define leadership, and partly because there are different, people have different temperaments, and different temperaments can be leaders. They just do it in different ways. Now, there's something in common about being a leader, though, and I would say one is that if you're an actual leader, you actually know where you're going, right? Because what are you going to do? Lead people in circles? It's like maybe they'll follow you, but you're not a leader, you're just a charlatan. So you have to know where you're going, and then you have to be able to communicate that, and then people have to trust you, so you actually have to be honest, because people aren't that stupid, at least not for a long period of time. And then where you're going has to have some value, because otherwise, why would anyone want to go along with you? So, and then you might say, well, what are the attributes then that make you a leader? And I would say, well, they're characterological, fundamentally. And this is not naive optimism or casual moralizing. It has nothing to do with that. We know, for example, that conscientiousness, the personality trait, is a good predictor of long-term success in most occupations, not all, but most, and that one of the things that's associated with conscientiousness is that people keep their word, they're trustworthy. And that's certainly one element of a leader, especially across any reasonable amount of time. You have to be able to trust the person. They can even be harsh, right? It doesn't matter, because you can see harsh leaders and kind leaders. But as long as they do what they say they will do, then you can follow them, and you know that the future payoff is secure, something like that. So the idea that characterological development is more important to leadership than primogeniture, I think that's the right word, primogenesis, anyways, being a firstborn, that's a very crucial psychological realization, that it's characterological development that makes you favored of God. And I do think we've forgotten this in many ways, because there isn't a lot of emphasis in our education system on characterological development. And that's very, very surprising to me. I think maybe it's partly because in our fractured society, we can't agree on what constitutes a reasonable characterological goal. So we just throw up our hands and don't educate our kids to any degree at all, especially in schools, about what an admirable person is like, or even let them know that, well, maybe you should actually try to be one, that's actually the most important possible thing that you could learn, right? So, and I also think, and I think this is laid out very thoroughly in the biblical stories as well, is that if there are enough people who are admirable, then things work. And if there aren't, then things are terrible. You get wiped out. You remember when Abraham is bargaining with God with regards to Sodom and Gomorrah, he asks God to save the city if there's like 40 admirable people, right? Respectable. But let's say admirable, right? I don't want to say good, because good is being corrupted in some sense by casual usage. I mean admirable, noble people, right? I think Abraham bargains God down to like 10. If there's 10 of them in the city won't be destroyed. And that's not very many in a city. So there's an interesting idea there, which is that there doesn't have to be that many people in a group who have their act together. But 0 is the wrong number. And if it's 0, then we're seriously in trouble. And I think that goes along with the idea of the Pareto principle in economics too, which is that it's a small minority of people who do most of the productive work in any given domain, but so a small number of properly behaving people might have enough of an impact to keep everything moving, and that might actually be true, but it can't fall below some crucial level. And I do think that we're in some danger of allowing it to fall below some crucial level, because our society seems to be at war in some ways against the idea of the individual and individual character per se. And I think that's absolutely catastrophic. And that's part of the reason that I'm doing these biblical lectures, because I think that I've known for a long time that the moral presuppositions of a culture are instantiated in its stories. They're not instantiated in its explicit philosophy. There might be a layer of explicit philosophy, and of course there is in the West, and a layer of explicit law, but underneath that there are stories. And there isn't anything under the stories except maybe behavior, and that's so implicit it doesn't even actually count. It's not a cognitive operation. And so this is the story. These are the stories that are underneath our culture. And so there better be something to them. That's what we hope. But more importantly, maybe we shouldn't toss them away without knowing what they mean, because if we toss them away, then we are throwing everything that we depend on away, as far as I can tell, and we will pay for it. We'll pay for it individually because we'll be weak. Because if you're not firm in your convictions, then someone else who's firm in their convictions you're their puppet, like instantly. And then you're also the puppet of your own doubts, right? Because unless you have convictions, you're going to generate doubts like mad, because everyone does. And then the doubts will win, and you'll be paralyzed, because there'll be 50% of you moving forward and 50% of you frozen stiff, and that'll be enough just to lodge you in place. And so, okay, so there's a psychologization of the idea of leadership, which is very important, and then it's associated with the idea of characterological development, and it's associated with the idea of struggle, not happiness, and it's also associated with this Abrahamic idea, which I really liked, and which was something that's been very useful to me as a consequence of doing these lectures, because remember at the beginning of the Abrahamic stories, Abraham's like a stay-at-home guy, right? He's like the guy who's 40 years old living in his mother's basement. And God says, like, get the hell out of there, get out in the world where you belong. Go do something difficult, because what you're doing isn't acceptable. And the first thing he does is go somewhere there's a terrible famine, and then he goes somewhere there's a tyranny. So, it's pretty funny. He follows God's call, and it's not like sweetness and light and paradise immediately. It's nothing like that. It's instantaneous combat, of the most difficult kind. So, but Abraham does in fact follow that impulse, and it's interesting too. I mean, I don't know. Here's another thing that made me an advocate of psychoanalytic thinking. And it was the sort of thing that started to terrify me about what the human psyche was actually like. I started to understand that not only were we like an amalgam of relatively autonomous subpersonalities, each of which had the possibility of gaining control, but that we were also victim, you might say, or beneficiary of impulses that were beyond our conscious formulation or understanding or capacity to resist. So here's a funny story. So I was talking to one of my Patreon people online this week, and he said he was a committed atheist, and that's fine. Lots of atheists are very honest people, and they're atheists because they don't know how to reconcile what they know with traditional claims, let's say, and they're not willing to just mangle them together, And there might be cynicism, all that associated with it as well. But he said he was entranced by these biblical lectures, which is pretty weird. And he said if someone would have told him a year ago that he was going to be obsessed with a sequence of biblical lectures, he would have told them that they were mad. And so we had a bit of a discussion about that, because this is an interesting thing, And he mentioned this. He said it was something like, you don't choose your interests, they choose you. And that's really worth thinking about too, man, because it's really hard to get interested in something you're not interested in, even if there's a good reason for it. You're studying for an exam, you find the material boring, anything will be more interesting than than the studying. Even though you know that that's what you need to do, you can't voluntarily grab yourself by the scruff of the neck, let's say, and shake yourself and say, sit down and concentrate. Your mind will just go everywhere. But then if you're interested in something, and even if it's something you shouldn't be interested in, because that happens all the time, then it's like you're a laser focus, man. You can pay attention forever. You can work until you're exhausted. You won't even notice it, and you remember everything. It's like, okay, if you can't control your interest, what does? And man, I tell you, you can think about that for a very long time. So Jung talked about the spirit Mercurius. You know, Mercury is the winged messenger of the gods. And here's how he conceptualized it psychologically. He thought this is what the ancient people who thought about Mercury as the winged messenger of the gods were trying to state psychologically. You know, your interest flits around. It's like there's something that captures it and that moves your interest from place to place. You know, like if you walk into a bookstore, you'll get interested in a particular book. It's as if the book grips you. Because you don't know why you're interested in that. You might, but often you don't know why you're interested in that book. And you know, your interest is flitting around. And so that's Mercury. The thing that makes your interest flicker around is Mercury, the winged messenger of the gods. And Mercury is the messenger of the gods because it's the things behind the scenes psychologically that are manipulating your attention. And for Jung, those were equivalent in some sense to the lost gods. And so for Jung, your interest was being manipulated behind the scenes by unseen forces that were associated with your characterological development across time. That was the manifestation of the self. So the self is the potential you, let's say. And the way it operates in the present is by gripping your interest and directing it somewhere. And that's part of the instinct of self-realization. It's a mind-boggling idea, man, really. I think it's correct. I can't see how it can't be correct. It doesn't mean I understand it completely, but it certainly seems phenomenologically correct. And I mean, the potential that you are has to manifest itself somehow in the here and now. It has to. And what better way than by directing your attention? You know, it's like, it seems like this might be useful for you, or maybe you get attracted to this person, or maybe you admire this person. That happens with kids a lot. They'll admire someone and then copy them. And you can see that that's obviously part of their developmental progression. Right? It's a form of hero worship, but kids are very imitative and they hero worship at the drop of a hat. And so they're entranced by the next stage of development. And if they see someone who embodies that, especially if it's in the zone of proximal development, it's something they could achieve, stretching a bit. They find someone who embodies that next stage of development and then they start to imitate them and act like them. Well, adults are no different. We're no different. We do it at a perhaps more abstract and sophisticated level. So, okay, so Jacob and Esau are hostile brothers. They're like Cain and Abel, except the mixture of Cain and Abel, and they're very different. Esau was red and covered with hair. He was a hunter and a man of the field. So he's like your basic jock, right? He's extroverted, he's outgoing, he's really tough. He's like extraordinarily masculine. He hunts, and he's a real favorite of his father. And so, and Jacob isn't. He's a dweller in tents. And yeah, right, exactly, right. And it says Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now that's a problem, right? That's a big problem. And there's a Freudian element to this. It's like this family is now divided because one child is the favorite of the mother, and that's Jacob, and one child is the favorite of the father. And so Jacob is kind of a mother's boy, I guess, to use a rather archaic phrase, and certainly not as admirable from his father's perspective as Esau, who's a tough guy who goes out with a bow and arrow and, like, you know, wanders around in the plains and brings animals home, and he's tough. He's a tough guy. So, but there's this discord in the family because one parent prefers one child and the other parent prefers the other. And it's obvious from the story that the parents do not communicate about this because they really take sides. And so there's a split in the family. And that's, I think, very realistic because one of the things that you do learn if you have a family, and of course most of you do, but if you also think about families, is that there's deep divisions within families very, very frequently that no one will ever talk about. or even think about often because it's too painful to think about, And Freud himself said, Freud was clearly his mother's favorite, and the family sacrificed a lot, including some of the potential ambitions of the other children in order to kind of put Sigmund Freud up on a pedestal and advance his education, and it worked. I mean, he turned into a great man, but there was a cost to his siblings, and Freud himself said that there was something about being the favorite of the mother that gave a person additional confidence throughout their life. And there's something to be said about that. Even someone like Erik Erikson, he noted that, very interested in child development, that first bonding with the mother was the place where trust was established. Maybe trust even in the goodness of existence was established. And so anyways, Jacob is Rachel's favorite, and Esau is Isaac's favorite. Now Esau, being extroverted, let's say, is also a bit impulsive, and maybe he's a man of action, he's not a forward thinker, but he's also doing hard work, and so, he goes out and he's hunting and he's worn out, and he comes home and he's faint with hunger, and Jacob is at home cooking. He's boiling up lentils, red lentils, and Esau comes in from the hunt and he's like half starved to death, and he's sitting there, and the aroma of these red lentils reaches him, and he's exhausted, and he tells Jacob that he wants some of this stew, and Jacob, who's being a pain in the neck fundamentally, basically says no. There's a teasing thing going on here, and won't give him any, and there's, you have to imagine this because it's not laid out explicitly in the story, but there's some dispute about whether Esau gets to have lunch, and Jacob finally says, well, I'll give you some, but you have to give me your birthright. And Esau, you think he must say something like, well, to hell with it. Take it, you son of a bitch. Take it. Just give me some damn stew. It's something like that. So that's what happens. But, with these archaic people, once you made a statement like that, you were done. That was it. And so Esau sells his birthright. And this turns out to be incredibly significant. Benson, who wrote biblical commentary, said, there's a bit of a twist to it. So Esau eats the red lentils, and then from then on his name is Red. And you got to use your imagination a bit. I mean, people are making fun of him, right? That's why they're calling him Red. I mean, he's already red because we established that, but no one was calling him Red before this. And so for the rest of his life, every time he goes out amongst his friends and family, they call him Red and sort of snicker because he's the, half-famished idiot who sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils. And so it's not that funny, actually. And so Esau is not happy about this. And it actually turns out that so what does it mean? It means don't sell the future for the desires of the present, and don't be casual about what you have. And then there's an archetypal element to this too. And Benson says, various have been the opinions what this birthright was which Esau sold. But the most probable is that together with the right of sacrificing, so determining what should be sacrificed and when, and being the priest of the family, it included the peculiar blessing promised to the seed of Abraham, that of being the progenitor of the Messiah and the heir of the special promises of God respecting Christ's kingdom. It was at least typical of spiritual privileges, those of the firstborn that are written in heaven. Well, that's a lot harsher than meets the eye to begin with. And so there's a very interesting, deep moral story there, which is, it's sort of, Esau does the opposite of a sacrifice. It's the reverse, right? He sacrifices the future for the present. And so the story basically says, the way it's laid out across stories, is that if you're the sort of person that sacrifices the future to the present, then that eradicates the possibility that you will bring the most noble being into existence. That's what it means. And you can, again, this is the psychological significance of the biblical story. So that's a bad thing to do if you want to realize your potential, let's say. You don't do reverse sacrifices. That's a very bad idea. And so Esau really did himself in by being too attached to the present without a vision of the future. So he's too in the moment, and he pays a heavy price for it. I mean, first of all, he loses his birthright and his double inheritance, so there's a practical consequence, and then there's a spiritual consequence, and then he's been made a fool of by his brother. Jacob means supplanter, by the way. That's what the name means. And Jacob is always trying to usurp Esau, as we've seen. And so Jacob gets one over on him, and doesn't make an older brother happy when a younger brother gets something over on him, that's for sure. And then he loses the opportunity to be the progenitor of the Messiah, which is like, he probably didn't realize that precisely, but it seems to be, it's kind of rough, that. So, and then there's a statement in Matthew 16:26, "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" It's an echo of the same idea. When you think, well, what does this idea of soul mean? And it's not intellect. And it's something like consciousness allied with character, I think. And I think the reason that it's valued so much is that, because you got to ask yourself, well, what do you really have when it comes down to it? So life is suffering, let's say, and you can pile up worldly goods, and the God in the Old Testament doesn't seem to have anything against that, really, right? The people who he favors seem to prosper quite nicely in the world, but they also have to make a choice between whether they're going to fundamentally sustain their character or whether they're going to prosper in the world when push comes to shove. And the idea constantly is that really what you have in the world that allows you the best possible defense against the suffering that's intrinsic to being is your character. That's what you have, period. And I don't think there is anything that's more psychologically true than that. Because everything else, well, first of all, your relationships with others depend on your character. And certainly this is part of the story of Noah's Ark, because his generations were perfect, so he had a very tight familial arrangement. Everyone trusted each other. That's a big deal if you hit a rocky patch in your life, right? And it's character that determines that. If you're generous and honest and all of those things, and people know they can rely on you, assuming they're not resentful, that's a whole different story. Then they're going to come to your aid when it's necessary. They're going to pull together with you. And when people are really after you for one reason or another, and they're accusing you of all sorts of things, and you're guilty because you have a past that's laden with characterological errors, then it's very easy for people to take you down, because they'll poke until they hit a place where you're guilty, and then you're done, because you'll do yourself in with your own judgment. And so Esau makes a very big mistake. And there's a sacrificial idea here too, which is, now and then you're going to be faced with a situation where it's something you really want, or your character. Maybe you'll have to lie about something, and you'll think, what difference does it make? I'll lie about it. Jacob does this. But there's a bunch of problems with that. One is that, well, now you know that you're the sort of person that will, in fact, deceive yourself about the nature of reality if something shiny is dangled in front of you. And that's not good, because it undermines your faith in yourself. And when you're really in trouble, they call that the dark night of the soul. When you're really in trouble, that's what you've got. You've got whether or not you can trust yourself, and that's it. When things are really harsh. And so if you've betrayed yourself in that manner, then you weaken yourself under the worst possible circumstances, and that's really not a good thing. So this is very practical advice. It's not casual moralizing. There's very little casual moralizing in these stories. In the next part of the story, there's some parallels with Abraham, and that's built into the narrative, I think, because Isaac is Abraham's descendant, and so we have to keep the narrative echoing forward, otherwise it loses its continuity. And there's a famine in the land that Isaac's in, and God tells him to stay the course anyways, repeating the promise he gave to Abraham, although Isaac goes to Abimelech, also telling the king and people that Rebekah was his sister, which is exactly what Abraham did when he went to Egypt. And so there's another echo there of the same. It's as if the story is being told for a second time, essentially. And that's supposed to remind you of the previous story. But they're careless. The king sees that Rebekah and Isaac are intimate together, and luckily he doesn't have them put to death. He just tells everybody in the kingdom that they're to be left the hell alone. And then Isaac prospers in that land, just like Abraham did in Egypt, until the Philistines asked him to leave. He's just getting too rich and powerful. Things are going too well for him, so he's asked to leave. Now, in the meantime, Esau gets married. And this is a funny little story. He says, he marries two women who give grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So whoever Esau marries, they're not popular with their in-laws, not in the least. That actually becomes relevant a little later because they drive Rebekah quite mad. So I get a kick out of that because that's very common. It's not easy to integrate new people into your family and hope that will go smoothly. It's actually one of the real catastrophes in life, right? You have a kid and maybe you get along with them and maybe you don't. But let's assume you do, but then they marry someone that you just don't like. Or maybe you think is wrong for them. I mean, that's really rough. What are you going to do about that? Because you're basically screwed both ways. If you have the person you love around, then you have to put up with this horrendous creature that they allied themselves with. And if you get rid of them completely, well, then you don't have your child anymore. So it's a very, very difficult position. And so that's another example of the realism, I think, of the stories. Now Isaac, who's hypothetically on his deathbed, asks Esau to hunt for venison because he likes venison and he's happy that his son is a hunter. And Rebekah overhears this. And so she conspires with Jacob to slaughter 2 small goats and make his father some stew because he wants Esau to make him stew out of venison. But Rebekah, who's being, I would say, let's say slightly deceitful or horribly lying, that would be more accurate, she conspires with Jacob. So Jacob kills 2 little goats, kids, and boils up a stew, and then he puts on some goat skins because Esau is a hairy character, and Rebekah dresses Isaac in Esau's clothing because Isaac can't see very well at this point, and so then Jacob goes into his father with the stew, and he's trying to disguise his voice, but it doesn't work very well, and so Isaac asks him to come close, and Jacob puts out his arm with the goat skin on it, and Isaac smells him too, and he smells like Esau, and which maybe wasn't the best thing, but and feels like him, and so because Isaac thinks he's on his deathbed, he decides to deliver a blessing hypothetically to Esau, and so, but it's Jacob, and so that's a big deal too, because the blessing is actually, as I said before, with these ancient people, it appeared as though once you said something, you didn't get to take it back. You couldn't say, well, look, you deceived me, so it doesn't count. It was like, they weren't maybe as well, weak might be one way of thinking about it, but another way is they weren't quite as attentive to context, because if I make you a deal and then it turns out that you've betrayed me, I may feel that the deal is no longer valid because the assumption was you were being honest to begin with, and that, violates the whole spirit. But that isn't how these people thought. They said, once you promised, man, you promised, and that was that. So Isaac blesses Jacob. He says, let God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over thy brethren. That's going to be rough on Esau. Let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. And so there's quite a remarkable painting of that. So there's Rebekah. She's looking pretty old, and Isaac's looking pretty blind, and Jacob's taking directions from his mother, and we might say he's perhaps a little old to be taking moral lessons from his mother, especially given how she's acting. And so it's a pretty ugly scene altogether, especially that we also know that Jacob already tricked Esau out of his birthright. And so now he's like taken the birthright and he's taken the blessing. And so, as I said, that Jacob, he turns out to be the father of Israel. It's like he's a reprehensible character. These are major league betrayals that he's engaging in. It's not trivial. He really, really pulls the rug out from under his brother. And you could say, well, Esau is not as awake as he might be. He's kind of a wild man, and fair enough. But it certainly seems to me that the predominant moral error falls on Jacob's shoulders. It's very treacherous behavior, what he's doing. So then Esau shows up, and he's got a nice stag for his dad, and it's like a little late for that. And he states that his brother was rightly named Jacob, which means supplanter, because he's been deceived twice. And Isaac answered, Esau's asking fundamentally if there's anything at all left over for him. And Isaac can't give him the same blessing because that's already been given, so he has to think of something else. And Isaac says, behold, I've made him thy Lord, and all his brothers I've given to him for servants, which includes you. And with corn and wine have I sustained him, and what shall I now do unto thee, my son? And Esau said unto his father, have you even one blessing for me, my father? And bless me also. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And, we already know that Esau is a pretty tough guy, by all appearances. And, he's out there hunting on his own and camping, and it's like he's no pushover. And the fact that this reduces him to tears is an indication of the magnitude of the betrayal. And Isaac says, behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. And by thy sword thou shalt live, and thou shalt serve your brother. And it shall come to pass when you will have the dominion, and you'll break his yoke off from thy neck. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will slay my brother Jacob. So fundamentally, if Isaac dies or when he dies, then we'll mourn for him, and then Jacob better look the hell out, because it's serious death coming his way. And he's got a point. He's in Dante's Inferno. I think I mentioned this at one point. So Dante's Inferno, it's a very interesting story. It's a descent into hell, eh? And it's actually one of the places that we sort of derive the popular conception of hell was partly based on Dante's imagination, on his work. And what Dante was trying to do was to discover the hierarchical structure of evil. And you might think there's a hierarchical structure of good. Some things are better than other things, but there's also a hierarchical structure of evil. Some evils are greater than other evils. And he put betrayal in the lowest part of hell. Right? So if you were betraying people, you were right beside Satan himself. And I think that's good. That's very smart. Well, Dante was a genius after all. And I think the reason for that is that, you see, if someone trusts you, they're laying their vulnerability open to you. Now, they might just be naive, let's say, and we won't think about that, because you're just a child if you're naive. You can still be betrayed. But if you're an adult and you trust, it's often because if you're an actual adult, it's you willingly open yourself up, knowing that you could be hurt, right? Because you're not naive anymore. So you decide to trust, and you say, I'll open myself up, and I know that I'm laying myself open to you if you choose to use that power. And then that's a good thing to know. If you've been hurt as a child or hurt as a naive person, you might say, well, why should I ever trust again? Which is a really good question. And the answer is, the reason you trust again once you're an adult is because you're courageous. You're courageous. It's an act of courage to trust. And the reason it's useful is because if you trust someone, you open the door to reciprocity and negotiation and cooperation, and you entice the best part of the person forward. And so it's a courageous act. But then if you betray someone, then what you've done is you've taken the best part of them, which is the part that will courageously trust, with open eyes, right? And you've stuck a dagger in that. And so you've purposefully damaged the best part of them. And so that's why it's such an egregious fault. And it's often people don't recover from that sort of thing. If you betray someone badly enough, you can damage them. Like, you can give them post-traumatic stress disorder if you really put your mind to it. And that's not just a psychological disorder. If you have post-traumatic stress disorder, it produces permanent neurological alterations that make you more neurotic, more sensitive to negative emotion, really for the rest of your life. Like, you can recover from it to some degree, but stress will tend to reinstantiate the PTSD. So you hurt someone, and it's not merely not that psychological is merely, but it's not merely psychological, right? It's fundamental physiological damage. So, anyways, Jacob's smart enough to get out of there, and which is also not really a testament to his integrity, right? I mean, he's done these terrible things at the behest of his mother because he wants power, and he wants to get it without deserving it, and then he finally goes too far and he hightails it out of there to another family member, to his mother's brother. And so it's not exactly the world's most heroic story, that's for sure. And so now there's an interlude here, and this is a really interesting interlude. It's the story of Jacob's ladder. So he's off to visit Laban, who's his mother's brother. And on the way, he has a sleep. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set, and he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows, which seems to indicate very bad planning on his part, and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and beheld a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and beheld the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed. And so this story of Jacob's ladder has really possessed the imagination of the West. And then there's a reason for that. It's because it's an archetypal story, because the idea of a ladder that reaches to heaven is one of the oldest ideas of mankind. So you find it widely distributed among the shamanic cultures, for example. And it's a hallmark of psychedelic experience. That's another way of thinking about it, which is a very peculiar thing. So there's one representation of the ladder. You see God up at the top there, peeking out from the clouds. Now, you know, that's sort of where we get the idea that God is in heaven, and then heaven's up in the sky. And that's an easy story to make fun of, because, you know, we've gone up to the moon and there's no God there. But this is not a reasonable way of conceptualizing what these experiences are about. These experiences, what this is, the opening up there, that's more like an opening into an alternate dimension. That's a better way of thinking about it. It's beyond, like, from the Judeo-Christian perspective, one of the things you have to understand is that God is beyond space and time. He's not in the universe. He's outside the universe in some manner. And so the idea that you have an experience of God and it's up isn't, the up is the best that the human imagination can do with what's essentially a form of extra-dimensional experience. Or that's the best way to conceptualize it. And these experiences aren't rare. You know, they make up the core of the shamanic tradition. And so there's an intrusion of the ancient shamanic tradition, which is tens of thousands of years old, into the biblical stories at this point. Now, why Jacob had a essentially shamanic experience is very difficult to tell, because we don't know what these old people were up to, right? And we don't know how much of the archaic religious tradition was still extant at that point in time. But we certainly do know that our ancient forebears were using psychedelic substances constantly, like Amanita muscaria mushrooms, for example, which were widely used in India before they became extinct. That's the theory anyways. That seemed to be the basis of the chemical soma, which much has been written about. And so we hear of this as a dream, or as a vision, and perhaps that's what it was, but perhaps that wasn't what it was either, and perhaps it was an experience that was induced by the same processes that shamanic people have always induced these experiences. And so we're going to go through this a little bit. So anyways, there's a connection between heaven and earth that opens up. That's the vision. And there's messengers moving up and down. Now, one way you can conceptualize that is psychologically, as we already discussed, that, you know, there are forces within you that are active and alive, and you can think of them in some sense as messengers of the higher self, and so you could think about this as an image of a psychological reality. And so we can stick with that, but here's some of the representations that have been made. I really like the one on the right. That's William Blake. I like the helix idea, and I don't think that that's fluke. There are helixes and double helixes and all sorts of imagery, very ancient and very modern, that are associated with both healing and with this kind of vision. So, and you see in the Blake representation, God is associated with, well, really with the sun and with light. And you see that on the left as well, that wherever God is where light is. And so that's a very interesting idea as far as I'm concerned as well. There's some other representations. One by Chagall. So now there's this idea that there's there's the possibility of opening up a line of communication between the human psyche and the transcendent divine. And there's a great image of Christ as Pantocrator, so creator of the world. It is one of the first mosaics, if I remember correctly, and I wish I remembered where it was, but I don't. But it's a very interesting image. I'm having a carving of it made at the moment by a friend of mine, but you see Christ's face portrayed in a medieval manner, and he's holding a book. So it symbolizes the importance of the book, as a means of transmitting wisdom. And his face is very asymmetrical. And the eyes are different, one side and the other. And one half of the face represents the human part, and the other side of the face represents the divine part. And, I also think about that psychologically, because I do think that that's the right way to conceptualize human beings, is that there's an aspect of us that's mortal and human and limited, but there's an aspect of us that's transcendent and divine as well. And it's latent in some sense, but there are times when it manifests itself. And this is not speculation, right? This is like the oldest experience of human beings. Now, it's not necessarily an easy experience to have, but it's reported everywhere. And it can be reliably induced, as we've discussed before, by chemical means, and I don't know what that means exactly. We've talked a little bit about psilocybin mushrooms, for example, and you could say that the mystical experiences that have been invoked in the newest experiments down at Johns Hopkins are derangements or forms of psychosis, because they have some similarity to psychotic experiences. Although psychotic people were given LSD in the 60s, and they always said that that was something different than what they were having. And if you give psychotic people amphetamines, you can make them worse. So they're biochemically separate, and we know that. But also the thing that's so interesting about the psilocybin experiences is that they reliably produce mystical experiences that the people rate as among the most important experiences of their life. And among those who have the psychedelic experience, positive things happen to them. And so that kind of messes with the whole psychosis theory, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to claim that you give someone a pill and they have a psychotic break and then they're healthier. It's like, no, that isn't how psychotic breaks work. You're not healthier after having one. You're a broken egg, and it's not easy to put you back together. So, and we know that people all over the world have discovered every manner of psychedelic substance that you could possibly. Well, you imagine there's lots of hungry people wandering the earth for a long time, and they ate every damn thing they could get their hands on, and now and then something very peculiar happened as a consequence. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the shamanic tradition, because it's associated with Jacob's ladder. So according to Mircea Eliade, who was a great historian of religion, a compatriot of Jung's, and they influenced each other quite substantially. Eliade believed that shamanism that used psychedelics was a degeneration from the original, more pure shamanism. But I think later scholarship has demonstrated that that's incorrect, that the shamanic ritual per se was a direct consequence of the discovery of, and ritualistic use of psychedelic substances. But anyways, Eliade identified 3 pathways to shamanism. And the shaman in a tribe was more educated than the typical person, with a larger vocabulary, and was the repository of the oral tradition. And so learned all the stories that had been passed down word to mouth. And people, by the way, are can very, very accurately tell the same story across generations. That's been quite well documented. So, and people who can't read really can remember, because what else are they going to do? Their memories are far greater than modern people's memories, because we can forget everything because we can just look it up. But they remembered things because they had no choice. My father knew someone who was illiterate and couldn't use numbers either when he grew up in Saskatchewan, 60 years ago. And he had sheep, if I remember correctly. And although he couldn't count, he knew if one of his sheep was missing, because he knew all the sheep. And so he could tell just by looking if one of the sheep was missing, but he couldn't count. And so people who don't have our particular set of skills, first of all, they're not stupid, and second, they have other skills that we don't understand to fill in the gaps. So Eliade identified spontaneous vocation. So you had the spirit of a shaman, let's say, so you're probably extremely high in openness, let's say, from a modern perspective. Hereditary transmission, so your father was a shaman and your grandfather was a shaman and so forth, and you got initiated into that process, or a personal quest. In Siberia, this is from Eliade, in Siberia, the youth who is called to be a shaman attracts attention by his strange behavior. For example, he seeks solitude, becomes absent-minded, loves to roam in the woods or unfrequented places, has visions, and sings in his sleep. If you put someone in a place that's deprived, where you're deprived from a sensory perspective, normal people will hallucinate quite quickly. So it seems what happens is that if you dampen down the sensory input, then you start to become aware of the background processes of your mind. It's something like that. It's like the signal-to-noise ratio. I got to get this right. As the noise decreases, some of the noise becomes signal. The background noise becomes signal. And you start to become aware of your own internal psychological processes. It's something like that. He has visions and sings in his sleep. In some instances, this period of incubation is marked by quite serious symptoms. Among the Yakut, the young man sometimes has fits of fury and easily loses consciousness, hides in the forest, feeds on the bark of trees, throws himself into water and fire, and cuts themselves with knives. We went to a potlatch on northern Vancouver Island about a year ago, and they had this one dance. It was the Kwakwaka'wakw natives, and they had this interesting dance that was the dance of the wild man. And so the person who invited us was the wild man, and he was dressed up in tree branches and so forth. And so he was the person who'd been in the bush too long, and he came in as a cannibal. And there was genuine cannibalistic rites among these people not so long ago. And he came in as a cannibal, and everybody had to wear this like cedar headdress, because if you had a cedar headdress on, then the cannibal wouldn't take a bite out of you. And they actually took this rather seriously, so you should have your cedar headdress on. And so he's looking around the crowd, and there's like 400 people in this place, and he could really act too. And so he's doing this wild man dance, and then all the women stood up and started to kind of dance in place and sing, and they were taming him. So that was really cool. It was really interesting to see that, because those people they've had an unbroken culture for about 13,000 years. That's how long they've been out on the island there. And it was very interesting to see the dramatization of the domestication of man by women laid out in that dance in that way. But it was also interesting in relationship to the shamanic tradition, because he came in as a wild man, right? And he had to be re-civilized in some sense and brought back down to earth. But by whatever method he may have been designated, a shaman is recognized as such only after having received two methods of instruction. The first is ecstatic, dreams, trances, visions. The other thing that this guy told me, and I have no reason to doubt him, he's also not a literate person, and so has a great memory. He does carving, traditional carving, and he's very good at it. He carved a 53-foot totem pole that's now in front of the Museum of Art in downtown Montreal. So if you ever go there, you can go see it. It won't be there forever, but it's there right now. And he was taught to carve by his grandparents, and he said that he dreamed in, you know what the Haida images look like. So the Kwakwaka'wakws are kind of like the Haida, same sort of imagery. He told me that he dreamed in those images. So when he dreams, that's the form that the things he dreams about takes. And he also said that he would talk to his grandparents in his dreams. So if he was working on a piece of wood and trying to figure out how to carve it, and he ran into a particularly difficult problem, he'd dream, and he'd have a conversation with his grandparents, and they'd help him figure out how to solve the problem, and then he'd wake up and he could go carve the... And the thing is, he told me these things sort of matter-of-factly, right? Like, you know what I mean? It wasn't like he was telling me these weird things that happened to him, although he was doing that to some degree. I asked him a lot of questions about what he carved and what it all meant, and that was just part of his explanation of how he did it. And he carved me a couple of doors that I have in my house, and one of them is quite interesting. Well, the two make a panel, and they're an underwater scene, and under the water there's a bunch of mythical monsters. Some of them are killer whales, and I think there's an octopus down there, and carved in this particular style. And he said that the other thing that happens to him when he dreams is he goes down to the bottom of the water where these mythical creatures are, and he gets inspiration from them. And so I thought that was extremely interesting too. We don't know what a mind that isn't hyper-civilized, let's say, hyper-literate like our minds are, because we're so bombarded by external stimuli. We have no idea what the natural mind is like, really. And so it was quite interesting to listen to that, and also to see the consequences, because he's quite a great carver. So the first is ecstatic, dreams, trances, visions. The second is traditional, shamanic techniques, names and functions of the spirits, mythology and genealogy of the clan, a secret language. This twofold teaching imparted by the spirits and the old master shamans constitutes initiation. Well, so, modern people have a problem with that because we don't really get initiated, but I would say that, let's say that we're each on a quest of some sort. You wouldn't be here, I don't think, if you weren't, because why else would you be here? And so you're on a quest of some sort to figure out, to struggle with the meaning of life, let's say. And you don't want to do that alone because you only last like 70 years, and good luck figuring it out on your own. It's just not going to happen. It's too complicated. And you'll be too isolated, right? If it's just you, that's insanity. No one can stand that. And so you hope that other people have things to tell you and that your culture has something to tell you, So you're on a quest, maybe not with the same intensity as a shamanic initiate, but, let's give you some credit. And then you're also trying to understand the wisdom of the past. And that's the second part of this. It's like, okay, well, you're a human being, and human beings have been telling stories for a long period of time, trying to figure out what's going on, trying to figure out how to orient themselves in the world. And so, partly what you're doing here is exactly what the shamanic initiate does in the second part of the process, which is to expose yourself to the degree that you can to names and functions of the spirits, mythology and genealogy of the clan, and the secret language. This twofold teaching, imparted by the spirits and the old master shamans, constitutes initiation. So that's the rebirth, right? That's what initiation is. It's being born again. And that's a birth of the spirit rather than of the body. It's something like that. And so it's the rebirth of an integrated psyche. That's one way of thinking about it. And a psyche that's individual, but also grounded in common humanity, in the wisdom of common humanity. And that makes you strong, or at least it makes you stronger. Because there's a limit to your strength, but God only knows to some degree what that limit is. People can be unbelievably tough. Unbelievably tough. And I think it's even the more admirable for human beings to be tough because we're so conscious of how we can be hurt. And we're so conscious of what that hurt can lead to. You can have your family taken away from you and you can be destroyed. And the fact that you can be courageous in the face of that at all is something that is absolutely unbelievable, right? And people deserve a lot more credit, I think, than people give themselves. Because the fact that we can be honorable under conditions of life and death, right, of suffering, that's a testament to the human spirit. And there's a profound anti-human ethos, I think, that pervades our culture, that considers human beings cancers on the planet, something like that, and that there should be less of us. It's the same spirit that motivated the guy who wrote the book about it better to have never been. And it's like, I don't see it that way, I think people do pretty well for having their leg caught in a bear trap and their head caught in a vice. They're actually doing pretty well because life is really hard, and the fact that we're not absolutely brutal and murderous all the time is really something remarkable, given what we actually have to contend with, that we can go out of our way to be honest and generous and altruistic and to care for each other under unbelievably dire circumstances and to act nobly sometimes under the most trying conditions. In Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, he tells story after story of people who acted abysmally, but also people who, under the worst threats imaginable, never sacrificed their character. And reading about that is really, well, it really makes you wonder. That's what it does. The future shamans among the Tungus, as they approach maturity, go through a hysterical or a hysteroid crisis, but sometimes their vocation manifests itself at an earlier age. The boy runs away into the mountains and remains there for a week or more, feeding on animals which he tears to pieces with his teeth. He returns to the village, filthy, blood-stained, and it's only after 10 or more days that have passed that he begins to babble incoherent words. The strange behavior of future shamans has not failed to attract the attention of scholars, and from the middle of the past century, several attempts have been made to explain the phenomena as a mental disorder. But the problem was wrongly put. For on the one hand, it is not true that shamans always are or always have to be neuropathic, mentally deranged. On the other hand, and this is the critical issue, those among them who had been ill become shamans precisely because they had succeeded in becoming cured. So it's not the descent into this strange subterranean psychological state that constitutes the transformation that makes the shaman, but it's the emergence back out of that. And that's a journey to the underworld and a rebirth, right? And there's this great book, this is a great book, by a guy named Henry Ellenberger, and he was an existential psychoanalyst and philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Discovery of the Unconscious, which I would highly recommend. It's on my list of recommended readings. It is a great book. If you want to know about the psychoanalytic tradition, it's the best introduction there is, and he discusses Adler and Jung and Freud, and does a very credible job of all three, but also takes the history of psychoanalytic thought back 300 or 400 years before Freud. And so it's very engaging reading and very interesting. And one of the things Ellenberger points out quite clearly is, and he associates this to some degree with this shamanic tradition, that both Freud and Jung in particular, underwent very intense periods of psychological disturbance, let's say. And I would say what was happening is that because they were questioning their axioms at the most fundamental level, they were deranging their cognitive and perceptual structures, right? And Jung was also experimenting with imaginative techniques, with visionary techniques, which he did a lot. And there was a period of his life where he was having a constant stream of visions, which he wrote down in a book called The Red Book. But at the same time, he was still functioning as a psychiatrist and operating normally in the world. And so, people have suggested that what he had was a psychotic break, but that's ridiculous because that's not how it works, man. If you're having a psychotic break, you're not being an effective psychiatrist. Those things do not go together, especially not for a long period of time. And so there's the possibility of extreme experience without psychopathology. And so, and Ellenberger, he says much the same thing about Freud, and about Charles Darwin as well, who underwent a terrible period of mental confusion, I would say, as a consequence of formulating his theory of evolution, which was really hard on him because he was a diehard Christian, and he knew what the implications of his theory were. He didn't know what to do about that, so it was very, very hard on him. So it's quite common for people of genius to go through an intense crisis, psychological crisis, but then resolve it, and the genius is in the resolution, right? The precondition for the genius is the dissolution in some sense, because you have to be obsessed with a problem. It has to grip you completely before you're going to concentrate on it so obsessively that you might come up with a solution. But it's the people who come up with a solution that are the prophets and the shaman and so forth and so on. And so this isn't something that only characterizes archaic cultures. We just don't recognize it in our own culture properly. And that's a problem. Well, sometimes we do. Right, you remember that in The Lion King, right? That Rafiki shows up, he's the shaman, he brings Simba down that tunnel, dark tunnel, that's the dark night of the soul. He has him reflect upon himself in a pool. When he reflects upon himself deeply, he sees the reflection of his father, then that becomes a thing of cosmic significance. And his father appears in the sky, just like God appears to Jacob, and basically tells him that it's time for him to grow the hell up and to return to the devastated kingdom and to set it right. And that's right, that's exactly right. I mean, we live in the devastated kingdom. That's an eternal truth. And it's the responsibility of the individual to grow the hell up and to set it right. Because when it's devastated and when things are not in place, then everyone suffers too much. And that's not good. And there's no excuse for not doing something about it because you don't have anything better to do. So, and even like children's movies tell you this. So, this is a fun one. This is from the Eadwine Psalter, 9th to 12th century. And that's Adam and Eve, but there is speculation that the fruit that they're eating there, you see, these psilocybin mushrooms, right? Because they're the only kind of mushroom that grow like that. So that's pretty wild, you might say. And then this is I think it's called Banisteria vine, if I remember correctly, and it's what ayahuasca is made out of. And it has this double helix form, which is very, very interesting. And the natives, nobody could figure out how the hell they made this ayahuasca. It which transports people spiritually in a very intense manner. And there's a whole religion based on it, like a modern religion as well as the archaic religion. And to make this stuff, they had to take two plants that don't grow anywhere near each other. And there's like 1 million plants in the Amazon, so how do you figure that out? Nobody knows. And then you have to cook them in this very particular way for a particular amount of time before you produce this stuff. So one of the plants has DMT in it, which is a very intense psychedelic, but it's very short acting. And the other has a MAO inhibitor. So if you take the DMT and you take the MAO inhibitor, then the DMT trip lasts for much longer. And so that's what these Amazonian natives figured out. And no one has any idea how they managed it. And if you ask them, they tell you that the plants told them how to do it, which isn't much of an explanation as far as modern people are concerned. But then when modern people take the ayahuasca and the plant, so to speak, starts to talk to them, they're a little less leery of the whole theory that the plants had something to do with this. So, and these things, I'm loath to talk about this because I'm not an advocate for drug use. But by the same token, you can't ignore empirical data. It's not reasonable. And the empirical data that psychedelic substances can produce mystical experiences and that those often have a transformative effect. I mean, one of the latest studies showed that if you took people who were dying of cancer and you gave them psilocybin in a sufficient dose to produce a mystical experience, that you radically decreased their fear of death. It's like, you got to think about that, man. That's tough. That's a tough experiment. You just wouldn't expect that. You think, you take someone, you derange them intensely, and then when they come back, they're not, even though they're dying, they're not nearly as afraid of dying. You got to kind of wake up and smell the roses when you see something like that. And the people who are doing this research are very reliable people. So there's the Amanita muscaria. There's this old idea, it's quite a funny idea, toadstools. So flies like Amanita muscaria. And this is ridiculous, there's some evidence that they actually like getting stoned. So, because animals will eat these, like reindeer will eat these things too, and they get pretty tripped out by them. And so I have this book on psychedelic use among animals, which is a small book, but, and so there's this idea that toads used to sit around the Amanita muscaria and wait for the stone flies to buzz badly around them and then snap them up. So that's pretty funny, I think. And there are mushrooms in the US that are the oldest organisms on the planet. Hey, there's one mushroom, I can't remember where it is, but it covers something like, oh God, I don't know, hundreds of square miles. It's like this huge thing, because it's all underground, right? And they have these very complex networks of mycelia, they're called. And they think the thing is like 150,000 years old, something like that. So there's plenty of things about the world that we don't know, that's for sure. There's the chemical makeup of the classic psychedelics. You see, they all have the same fundamental structure. This is serotonin. That's one of the major brain neurotransmitters. And so what happens with the psychedelics is that they alter the brain function by altering the neurochemical utilization of serotonin. They change the manner in which the serotonergic systems work. And the serotonin system is a very basic system, because when you're an embryo and your brain is developing, it's the serotonin projections that basically orchestrate the development of your brain. So they're very archaic circuits, very, very archaic circuits. So, and this is the paper, I think I stole this from psilocybin Griffiths, who's been doing a lot of this research. Psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. So, why? That's a good question, right? So here's a question for you. It is beyond dispute that human beings are capable of religious experience. Why? Why is that exactly? And you can associate it with psychosis, but that doesn't work. Because the theory doesn't hold water. It's not the same thing. So why is it there exactly? And it's not an easy thing to figure out. I'm always trying to figure out a biological explanation for everything, right? Because if you want to find something to stand on, you want to make sure that it can resist a challenge. And so if I can find an explanation for something that's reductionistic and materialistic and biological, then I'm going for that. But that's a tough one. Consciousness is a tough one. The moral sense is a tough one. They're not easy things to crack. The Big Bang is a tough one. So You know, I mean, a cynic might say that maybe sometimes when people are close to suicide, they'll have a mystical experience, you know. And maybe you say, well, it's a last-ditch attempt of your brain to delude you into thinking that your life has some significance, you know. And that's a plausible theory, but I don't think it accounts for the generality of the phenomena. So I don't buy it. What happens in the shamanic experience is that the shaman has the experience of being reduced to a skeleton first. So a death experience, a very realistic death experience. And then the next thing that happens is that he finds himself in a place where he's communing with the ancestral spirits. And then after that, there's the climbing of something like the ladder, Jacob's ladder, say, and an encounter with God for all intents and purposes. And it's very widespread phenomena. It's the world tree, and I've thought about this a lot, trying to figure out what this represents. According to a Yakut informant that's in Siberia, the spirits carry the future shaman to hell and shut him in a house for 3 years. Here he undergoes his initiation. The spirits cut off his head, which they set off to one side, for the novice must watch his own dismemberment with his own eyes, dissolution to the primary elements in some sense, and hack his body to bits, which are later distributed among the spirits of various sicknesses. It's only on this condition that the future shaman will obtain the power of healing. His bones are then covered with new flesh, and in some case he is also given new blood. So there's a death and resurrection experience that's associated with the shamanic ritual. We're here in the presence of a very ancient religious idea which belongs to the hunter culture. Bone symbolizes the final root of animal life, the mold from which the flesh continually rises. It is from the bone that men and animals are reborn for a time. They maintain themselves in an existence of the flesh, then they die, and their life is reduced to the essence concentrated in the skeleton from which they will be born again. That's a good graphic representation of the experience. That's an old painting by, I think it's Hieronymus Bosch, if I remember correctly. And I really like that because it's reminiscent of the near-death experiences that you hear people describe. And they're quite common as well. And I had a very weird experience once. I don't think I've told you this story. I was assessing someone who had gone through a car windshield, and he was very depressed. It had happened a long time before, but he was very depressed. And the insurance company was basically accusing him of malingering, because he'd been depressed for so long, and he'd sort of healed up and everything. But if your left hemisphere is damaged, especially the frontal part of your left hemisphere, then you can be in a chronic state of depression, because the left hemisphere, generally speaking, is responsible for positive emotion. And so if it isn't there, then it's like negative emotion for you. And so I went and assessed him, and I was giving him this, I think it was called the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a kind of a standard half personality test, half psychopathology test. And he was filling it out. He was a very serious guy, middle-aged guy. Nothing about him was new agey in the least. He was like an accountant. I think in fact he was an accountant, if I remember correctly. And there was one question, and it said, "My spirit has left my body." I think that's right. It's very close. And he stopped and he asked me, he said, "I'm not sure how to answer this." And so I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, after I went through the car windshield, I was in a coma for 3 weeks, something like that, and I died." I think he said he died 3 times. And he said that he couldn't remember anything during that period of time, and he couldn't remember the car accident. That's retrograde amnesia. It's quite common with head injuries. And he said that during one of those experiences, and this is all he remembered from the hospital, was that he came out of his body and went down the long tunnel of light. You've heard these near-death experiences. And then saw his family members there and saw the heavenly light, and then realized that it wasn't his time and came back to his body. Now, what was interesting about this guy was that, well, first of all, I didn't ask him about this, right? He basically volunteered the story, and it was instigated by this question. And he didn't know that anybody else had ever had an experience like that, because I asked him if he'd ever heard anything about like that, and he said no. So that was interesting. But what really was interesting is, how the hell did he remember that? Right? Because he had amnesia during that entire period of time. He was in a bloody coma. It's like he didn't remember anything, but he remembered that. And so, well, those experiences are more common than you think. And then there's a painting of one, which is quite interesting. And that's like a tunnel to heaven. It's the same basic idea. It's a little bit more suffering going on in this one, I think. But that's pretty much typical of Hieronymus Bosch. I mean, I don't know what was up with that guy, but he was one strange character. Now, the Scandinavians have this idea that the world is a tree. And I've been thinking about that a lot. I think that the tree idea, a tree is something that is grounded in matter, let's say, and that reaches up to heaven. In the Scandinavian tree at the bottom, there's quite a cool idea. At the bottom of that, see, this tree is constantly being gnawed by snakes. You can sort of see the snakes at the bottom. And at the same time, it's being watered, and the water makes the tree grow at the same rate that the snakes gnaw on its roots. So it's like a yin-yang idea, that there's continual chaotic destruction and replacement at the basis of whatever this process is. But the tree seems to me to be a representation, not so much of, it's like a different dimensional space. That's what's trying to be represented. So imagine that, you're structured. If you take powers of 10 magnification, say human beings are about in the middle of the tiniest thing and the largest thing, if you do it by powers of 10. And so, you have a subatomic level and an atomic level and a molecular level, and, then maybe a level of organs, and then there's you, and then there's your family, and so on, all the way up the tree, fundamentally. And so I think that what this tree represents, and this is the thing that the shaman moves up and down, I think that's what it represents. It's this different view of its dimensionality. It's something like that. And I think that what happens in the psychedelic experience is that consciousness can travel up and down that structure. It's something like that. And maybe not only up and down it, but maybe right through it. And I know that's a radical claim. It's a really radical claim. And it might be wrong, but it's probably wrong even, because most radical claims are wrong. But I'm not so sure it's wrong. And here's something cool. So that's the Scandinavian world tree, and that was drawn by an anthropologist who visited the tribes in the Amazon who use ayahuasca. Now, you see, it's a tree with snakes. Well, that's reminiscent of the story in Adam and Eve, obviously, but it's also reminiscent of our primate dwelling place, right? Because that was basically our ancestral home, a tree surrounded by snakes, and the snakes like to eat us. And this is a long time ago. This is like 50 billion years ago. It's really a long time ago. And so we don't know where these images come from precisely. But I do have the suspicion that we use the circuitry that we developed to detect snakes to represent the unknown as such, because like a snake is something that comes out of the unknown, and like we evolved, right? We all evolved out of an animal substructure, and so we had to get our biological cognitive structure from somewhere, and we have this capacity of thinking about the absolute unknown and the terrors that are involved in that, the horrors that can emerge from what we don't understand. And it stands perfectly to reason that we would use circuits that were already pre-developed for that, and that this is a reasonable representation of the existential structure of the world. So, and I think I might have showed you this before, but it never ceases to amaze me, this picture. So my son drew this when he was 8, and so on the right you see mushroom houses, and they have the names of all his friends on them, and so that's order, right? And then on the left side you see chaos there, and that little orange thing is a bug. And then there's a river that runs right down the middle, and so that's like the yin-yang symbol with the divide in the middle. So that's quite cool. And then there it is. There's Jacob's ladder. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk, which is, by the way, another variant of the same shamanic story. And there are bugs going up and down it. And they're taking messages from heaven. And then up there in heaven, it's got the sun, and there's St. Peter. And I don't know where in the world he got this. It's not like he had a lot of religious education. I mean, despite me. And there's the pearly gates up there, and that was the world as far as he had a very well-ordered psyche, I would say, and still does. But when he drew that, it just absolutely blew me away. And so I had it laminated, and it's in my office because, well, I don't know, because like, what the hell do you make of that? That's why. So, well, you sort of get the picture there. The cathedrals, the great cathedrals of Europe they're like the forest in stone, right? And they try to represent the light coming through the leaves, and so it's sort of our ancestral forest home, but it's transformed into these great sculptures of stone, and they produce awe because of the combination of light and darkness and color, but also I think for the same reason that huge trees produce awe in people, and we don't want them cut down. They seem sacred in some sense, and perhaps they are, but it also seemed to me, this is an intuition, that the architects of these great cathedrals were trying to express something that's deep and structural. They're trying to express the idea that if being was constituted properly, then it would be organized from the subatomic level all the way up to the highest cosmic level perfectly, so every layer stacked on top of each other without any contradictions, and that would be an ideal mode of being, and everything would come together under those circumstances. And that's what's being expressed in these cathedrals. It's not all that's being expressed, because they're also shaped like a cross. And the idea is that the center of the cross, which is the center of suffering, is also the place of the individual, the place where the transformation takes place. That's all built into the architecture as well. And so then there's the tree-like structures that make us up. It's stretched down to the tiniest realities, the microcosm. Then there's this idea, it's all represented in the same way. Again, it's this idea, especially the mandala up in the top right, it's the idea of this perfection of crystalline structure, and that's what the yogis are trying to attain when they organize their bodies. They're trying to get every single layer of their being aligned properly. And it's something like, and you can kind of see an echo of that in I think that's a Tibetan sand painting, if I remember correctly, on the bottom left. The idea is that if you get yourself aligned properly, then information can flow along that tree that's you without impediment, something like that. And that would be like a state of optimal health. And that both physical and spiritual exercises can put you in that state. And those are all clouds of ideas that surround this idea of a ladder to heaven. And so Jacob is talking to God, and God says, "Behold, I am with thee, and I will keep thee in all places where you go, and bring you again into this land, for I won't leave you until I have done that which I have spoken to you of." And Jacob awakened out of his sleep, and he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not." And he was afraid and said, "How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for his pillows and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. That's a sacrifice. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all of that is given to me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee." And that's a pretty good place to stop. So now I'll just conclude. So you have this very morally ambivalent character, right, who's so far, pretty much everything he's done that we're familiar with is not good. So he's betrayed his brother horribly twice, badly enough so that his brother wants to kill him. and everyone can kind of sympathize with his brother. So, and then he runs away, essentially, because his mother tells him to, which is not exactly a testament to his character. And despite that, strangely enough, he has this experience, and that's heartening, I guess. And that's the point, is that people are predisposed to terrible error. There's no doubt about that. And yet, when I was writing my latest book, I had a friend of mine, Norman Deutsch, wrote the foreword. And Norman's written a couple of great books, and he's Jewish. And he read some of what I'd written, and he took me to task for making the God of the Old Testament, from a Christian perspective, too harsh and unforgiving. And I rewrote a fair bit of it because of his criticism and because of what I've learned doing these lectures. It's like, it's not exactly right, what happens in the Old Testament is if you screw up, especially if you know you do, and you decide that you're not going to do anything about it, so it's conscious and deliberate, then look the hell out. You are in serious trouble. And I actually think that's also psychologically accurate. One of the things Jung pointed out, and this always struck me, was that if you don't know what you're doing, this is actually in the Gospel of Thomas as well, interestingly enough, as one of the Gnostic Gospels, Christ tells his followers something like, if you make a mistake and you don't know what you're doing, then you'll be forgiven for it. But if you make a mistake knowing what you're doing, and you do it anyways, then good luck to you. And I think that's psychologically accurate. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting about the judgmental God in the Old Testament, however, is that he can be bargained with. And even if you make mistakes, especially if you're unconscious of them, if you haven't learned yet, let's say, then you always have the opportunity to return to the proper path. And people get cynical about that because there's, this mostly Christian idea that you could live a terribly sinful life, but if you repented on your deathbed, it's like heaven for you. And it's like, well, that sounds like a great deal, right? It's like, you can do whatever the hell you want until just before you die. Of course, you might not know when that is, so that's a problem. Then you can just say, well, I'm sorry, and everything's forgiven. But the problem with being cynical about that sort of thing is that it's no trivial matter to repent. Because to repent means, to figure out what you actually did. And the worse things that you did, the more horrible it is to figure it out. It's no joke, right? And there's no genuine repentance without understanding of the depth of your depravity. And so, if you've lived a particularly reprehensible life and you come to understand it, I think that in and of itself could kill you. It's a terrible thing to wake up and see what you've done, if what you've done is truly terrible. So there's no easy out. It's not an easy out. It's just pure cynicism to associate that idea with an easy out. It's not. But there is that positive idea that's continually represented, is that the individual is the source of moral choice, and the individual is prone to genuine error and temptation in a believable and realistic way. But that doesn't sever the relationship between the individual and the divine, and the possibility of further growth. And then I would say, well, thank God for that, because without that, who would have a chance, right? Who would have a chance? And so, the idea that the deity as presented, the infinite, let's say, as presented in the Old Testament is merely judgmental is definitely wrong, and is in fact something that you can contend with and bargain with. I'll close with one thing. One of the things that I learned while I was going through this was the meaning of the name Israel, because Jacob eventually gets named Israel. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the next lecture, but Israel, and so he's also the father of Israel and the father of the 12 sons who make up the 12 tribes of Israel. But what Israel means is he who struggles with God. And that's such an interesting idea, because it's, again, a psychological idea. And that's why I said earlier that it isn't obvious in the Old Testament what it means to believe in God, because what Jacob does is struggle with God. And I think that that's a really good characterization of an ethical life, because if you're trying to lead an ethical life, that's what you're doing, is you're struggling. Blind belief isn't helpful because you don't know what you're believing in. It's just not that helpful. But if you're possessed by by the desire to orient yourself properly, but also confused by the existential structure of the world, which we all are, then what you're doing when you're trying to orient yourself properly in life is struggling ethically. And Jacob actually gets quite hurt. He wrestles with God, literally, and God dislocates his thigh. And so, the idea there is watch the hell out, right? The thing that you're contending with is powerful, although you can contend with it. That's the thing that's so interesting. But, you do it at some genuine peril, which I think is exactly right. But the idea that Israel, so there's Israel, the state, let's say, and Israel, the promised land, and all of that. But there's this more important idea, which is, again, a psychological idea, which is the state of Israel, which is the promised land, is the state that everyone who wrestles with God exists in. And that's not happy, naive belief in, an eternally blessed afterlife. It's not that. It's not a wish fulfillment. It's to be actively engaged in life, in the difficulties of life, right? And trying to find the path. Because that's what wrestling with God is. It's trying to find the path. And that seems to me what belief means fundamentally in the Old Testament, and perhaps in the New Testament as well, is that belief is expressed in trying to find the path. And that's an ethical struggle, and it's a real struggle. It's the struggle of life. So as long as you're willing to engage in that struggle, then hypothetically you have the divine behind you. And so I believe that. I think that's true. Because the other thing I see is that the people who set things right so that the horrible forces of cosmic destruction don't do us in, the people who are trying to set things right are the ones that are struggling ethically. And that there is a redemptive element to that. And I don't think there's any way of being cynical about that. So thank you, Will.